Likutei Sichos, Chelik Chaf, Volume 20, the third Sicha of Parshas Noach. This Sicha will explain the idea of converting the name of Hashem, namely the name Elikim, which is typically associated with din, with severity, with judgment, to Rachamim. And also explain the function of these names, that is the various aspects of Hashem. Just several verses which is a good idea to be familiar with in order to better flow through the Sicha. Number one, of course, the first verse in the Torah, Bereishis bara Elikim, and there Rashi explains why Hashem uses the name Elikim in order to create the world. And Rashi explains that in the beginning, Hashem sought to create the world with the Midas Hadin, with the attribute of din, of judgment, of severity, and then he saw that the world cannot survive that way. So it says, Shitef imay Midas Harachmim. Hashem aligned with it the attribute of mercy, or in fact, as the Rebbe will explain later in the Sikha, not only aligned with it, but put the attribute of mercy, of compassion, as superior to it. Another verse is in chapter 8, verse 1, the one that is from our parsha. It says, Vayiskar Elikim es Noach v'eskol achai. This is the verse on which the Sikha goes, the Rashi of this verse, that Hashem remembered Noach and all the living things that were in the Teva, in the ark, and therefore Hashem decided to end the Mabul, and that led him eventually to make the covenant where he promised never ever to bring destruction over the entire world. Another verse, or verses that are to be familiar with, chapter 6, verses 5 through 7, where over there it describes how Hashem came to conclusion to bring about the Mabul, the destruction of the world. And it says, Vayar Hashem kira b'ro'as Adam. Hashem, here it's using not the name Elikim, but the name Hashem, Yud-Kei Vav-Kei. And he saw how terrible mankind has become, and therefore he said in his heart, I'm going to destroy all of them. Another thing to be familiar with is the Psukei Zichreinos from the Tfilas Musaf of Rosh Hashanah. In the Musaf of Rosh Hashanah, which is not that long ago, we recited verses of Malchias, Zichreinos, and Shofros. In the Psukim of Zichreinos, of remembrance, we cite various psukim, various verses in which it describes how Hashem remembered us, or mankind in general, but us in particular. And over there, it mentions this verse where it says that Hashem remembered, he remembered Noach, Vayiskar Elikim es Noach, and we ask Hashem, just like He remembered everyone, remembered him, remember us too. Let's another quick introduction. We know the Shem Hashem, Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, is typically associated with Rachamim, with Chesed, with kindness, with mercy, and also with being higher than nature, supernatural. The name Elokim, the name Elikim is typically associated, as we already mentioned, with Gevura, with severity, or with Din, with judgment, which is from the same family, and also associated with the limitations of nature. In fact, the word Elikim with the Hey is the same gematria as the word Hateva. Just a rule in Rashi which we're going to encounter. We know that Rashi typically addresses any matter, any question, any issue that needs explanation. But he always addresses it the first time it comes up. Meaning, the first time you encounter a question of that sort, Rashi takes the time to explain it to us. In fact, the next time you encounter it again, he's not going to explain it because he relies upon the fact that he had already explained it. What happens, however, when Rashi explains something, and then when you look back, you say, wait, it seems to be the very same question that had already appeared, but there Rashi had seemed to ignore it. Rashi didn't seem to address it at all. That in itself is very telling. That's what we have to look for a reason. Why is it that there Rashi didn't find it necessary? He didn't feel compelled to explain it, but whereas here, in the second time around, or now when it comes around, suddenly Rashi feels that it's important to explain it to us so we can better flow through the pasuk. Another thing to be familiar with is the Nishmes Yisrael. Our Nishamas, the love of Hashem towards the Nishama of a Yid, it says in the way the Rebbe Rasha brings it, is mushrash ba'atzmusay. This is something that is deeply rooted, so to speak, in Hashem's essence. There is no reason for it, and therefore there's nothing that can change this love. It can never, ever be altered in any way. Deep, deep down, no matter what happens, Hashem has this innate love for Neshamas Yisrael. Let's go into Sicha. So on the verse, as we said in chapter 8, verse 1, that Hashem remembered Noach and all the living things. So on the words, the heading of Vayiskar Elikim, that Hashem remembered, but he uses the name Elikim, Rashi explains, this is really the name of Din, of judgment. However, because of the tefillos, because of the prayers of tzaddikim, it became converted. It was nepach. It switched over to the attribute of compassion. Then Rashi continues. This is the power of the prayer of tzaddikim. However, the wickedness of the rishayim, of the wicked ones, has the power to do the reverse. That it converts the attribute of mercy, the name of Hashem, to the attribute of judgment. Where do we see it? And this going back to the beginning stages of this parsha. When it says that Vayar Hashem, it uses the term Hashem, the name of Hashem, which is associated with compassion. And there he saw that the man was so bad, Vayomer Hashem, Hashem said, I will destroy everything in the world. So here you see that it took the name of Rachamim and switched it over into the Din. Now, of course, the question is, in the verse Vayomer Hashem Emcha that we just quoted, that it says Vayomer Hashem, Hashem said I will destroy, meaning Hashem, which is typically associated with the attribute of mercy, decided to do something so severe, so full of judgment, to destroy the world. It would seem to be the same question that arises here in our verse. Over there, however, Rashi doesn't say anything. Rashi doesn't explain it. Moreover, you can't say it's because there was no question really, because and it's not really a question. It's not really, so to speak, a disturbing matter. It is, because the fact is that once Rashi explains the Vayiskar Elokim in our pasuk, he goes back to that pasuk and he addresses it. So how come he didn't address it in its place? From this, we can deduce that while learning that pasuk, the question does not yet arise. It's okay. It would make sense. It's something that you could accept, and Rashi doesn't have a need to explain it. However, once Rashi explains it here, once Rashi addresses here Vayiskar Lekim, this compels Rashi also to address, going back, so to speak, address retroactively that verse. Now, one cannot attempt to answer and say, well, it could be that previously we weren't yet familiar with the differences between Shem Hashem and Shem Elokim, the name of Hashem which is associated with the mercy, the name which is associated with the judgment. That is not the case. Why? Because right in the beginning, in the very first verse of the Torah, Rashi says, Bereshis Elikim, that Hashem, it uses the name Elikim, and constantly during the 6 days of creation keeps on repeating the name Elikim. Rashi explains, as we said in the introduction, that in the beginning Hashem had the thought to create the world with judgment. When he saw that it cannot exist, then he aligned with it, or as we'll see in a moment, he aligned with it and made superior to it, he prefaced to it the attribute of mercy. So the Rebbe says precisely with that, we'll get an appreciation of what's going on there. What is that? When we look into the wording, to the actual expression in that Rashi, that first Rashi, where he gave us an idea already of the difference between Shem Elikim and Shem Hashem, and he asks, in other words, he answers, he addresses the idea why Hashem did not create the world with the name of Hashem. With there we can already get an appreciation for the power of the Shem Hashem, the Midas Harachamim, and that will help will explain to us how come in the previous pasuk, in chapter 6, verses 5 through 7, why Rashi didn't address it there. See, what does Rashi say? Quote, Hashem saw that the world cannot survive, could not exist only with the attribute of judgment, of severity. So what did he do? V'hiktim midas harachamim v'shitva l'midas adim. Then what did he do? He gave precedence. Listen to the words. He gave precedence to the attribute of compassion, and he aligned it, or he partnered it together with the attribute of judgment. The fact that Rashi says v'hiktim midas harachamim, from that it comes out that it's not only that Hashem made an alliance between the two, kind of he mixed them up together, and sometimes this one prevails, sometimes the other attribute prevails. But rather what Rashi is saying is that in any situation, in all circumstances, it is ultimately the midas harachamim, the attribute of mercy, which has the precedence and priority. In other words, that it's the main attribute in all decision making, so to speak. Meaning that even if it's a situation in which we find that in the world finds itself in a situation where it is being judged, things aren't good, and there may be a very compelling reason to hand down punishment to the world. Even then, even the punishment, it must come down after the final ruling, meaning the final say has midas harachamim, the attribute of mercy. Of course, we also need to have the attribute of severity. In other words, why not just have just attribute of mercy? Because you do need severity. There needs to be punishment and reward. Why? Because the world is here for Torah and mitzvahs. And one of the motives that, literally speaking, is that when there's punishment and reward, that is a motive for the average person to fulfill the Torah mitzvahs, and therefore you do need to have din. But getting back to it, the bottom line is, what comes out from that Rashi is that ultimately it's the midas harachamim, it is the attribute of mercy that is the prevailing one and that has the final say. It has the priority over everything. And according to this, we can understand why in that verse Rashi didn't even address it. Why? Because when we read that verse and it says Hashem saw everything was so terrible, and Hashem said, I am going to destroy the world, we can understand it very easily. That there was a discussion, there was, so to speak, a deliberation as to what's going to happen, what's going to be with all these sinful people, with the world as it was in a deteriorated mode, and then final word was midas harachamim. So it's almost like a short pasuk. Instead of going into the details of what everyone said and what everyone argued, it gives us the final ruling, which, as we said, coming out from that Rashi, that it has to come through the attribute of mercy. Now, it's true that the actual destruction comes from the Shem Elikim, it comes from the attribute of judgment, but the final word, as we said, comes from the attribute of mercy. In other words, Rachamim always gets the final word. Therefore, Rashi had no need to explain it there, because he already gave us this idea already in the first verse in Parshas Bereshis, right when we began the Torah. However, when it comes to this verse over here, where it says Vayiskar Elikim, that Hashem, Elikim, remember, not Hashem, the attribute of judgment, and the attribute of judgment is the one who remembered and took Noach out and saved the world and made the covenant. This already raises the question. This is already something which is a novelty. This is a total chidush. Because it's not usually Elohim who has the final word. It is usually Hashem who has the final word. The Shem Hashem, the Shem Midas Harachamim. Therefore, Rashi feels compelled to explain it that something very unique and novelty took place here. And that is that the prayers of the tzaddikim are so strong and so compelling that the power of it is that it can convert, it can transfer Midas Hadin to Midas Harachamim. Now that we've established that there's such a phenomenon, that there's some times where there's an extreme situation in which you can actually change, convert Midas Hadin to Midas Harachamim. Now Rashi takes us back to the previous verse, where when we studied it then, there was no question. But now that we are privy to this idea, Now that he has alerted us that sometimes in unique circumstances, in extreme situations, this happens, Rashi sheds light on what happened back there. That it wasn't a case of just the final word, so to speak, of Shem Hashem, of the Midas HaRachamim, saying that it's going to destroy the world, but rather over there what happened is that Midas HaRachamim itself became Midas Hadin. That it became this Hapich, Midas HaRachamim and Midas Hadin. But Rashi could not explain it before, because before there was no issue. Now this issue is something that is in the forefront. Now we're privy to it. Now Rashi brings that to there. However, the question remains, why was it necessary in our pasuk? Why was it necessary in order to bring about the promise, the covenant with the world that never ever will there be destruction in the entire world? Why was it necessary for Midas Hadin to convert to Midas HaRachamim? Why was it necessary? Why wouldn't it have sufficed if Hashem would have remembered, Midas HaRachamim would have remembered Noach, and Midas HaRachamim would have made the final decision to make such a covenant? Why wouldn't that have been enough? The answer is because when it says Vayiskar Elokim, this is not just about Hashem remembering the actual people who are there in that time, in that real time, in the Teva, in the Ark. But rather, Vayiskar Elokim is something deeper. This was the beginning of the process of the covenant, which will lay down the promise for the rest of the existence of the world, that Hashem will never destroy the world, that there will never ever be a Mabul. And therefore it would not have sufficed just for Midas HaRachamim to take the lead and make the final decision. Why? Because if Midas Hadin would not have been fully aligned with it, so to speak, then it would have always left room for the possibility at a future time that when things get really, really bad and the world perhaps is in a very degraded state, that there the Midas Hadin would come back, since it was never part of this decision making, so to speak, or he didn't have the final word, and come back and make a compelling enough argument that even Midas HaRachamim would have to go along with it, and God forbid bring about to the destruction of the world. And therefore it was necessary for Midas Hadin to convert to Midas HaRachamim. So Midas Hadin, the attribute of judgment, became the attribute of mercy and thought through that prism. And therefore the decision was not only on the accord of Midas HaRachamim having the final word, but it was Midas Hadin itself also that participated in it, and therefore it's non-reversible. To explain this more esoterically, when we look in the Siddur in Rosh Hashanah, in the Psukei Zechronos, what do we say? We say Vayiskar Elokim es Noach. We bring this pasuk. Now, you think about it, what is Rosh Hashanah all about? So we know that in general, Rosh Hashanah is a day of judgment for the entire world. But in particular, it is a day of judgment for Am Yisrael. In fact, all the psukim that we say, whether it's in Malchias, whether it's in Chreines, whether it's in Shofros, are all psukim that pertain to Am Yisrael. So how does this pasuk relate to us? Vayiskar Elokim es Noach, as we just said, has to do with the covenant of the world. This led to the bris, the covenant that Hashem made with the entire world. So how come we quote this verse? How come we try to deliver, so to speak, on the power of this verse on Rosh Hashanah? The answer is that really this verse, when it says Vayiskar Elokim es Noach, is not about the world in general. Actually, as the Rebbe Rashab explains, that Vayiskar Elokim es Noach really is about Hashem remembering the essence of the soul, the neshama, the Noach that's deep, deep down. And that's why we say it. And that's why, as we say it in the words, we say V'games Noach ba'av zacharta, that you remembered Noach with love. Why do we put that in? We bring this verse and we say you remembered him with love, and therefore you should remember us. What does the love come into this? What is this about the love? The answer is because, as the Rebbe Rashab explains, because since this has to do with not with the Noach as the person who was there in the Teva, they're in charge of the animals and the human beings that lived at the time, but rather the aspect of Noach as it pertains to the neshama, to the essence of the soul. There, the essence of the soul is deeply rooted in the essence of Hashem, and therefore it's ava atzmis. It's not something that's changeable. It's not something that can be compromised in any way. The idea of it is as follows. The covenant that Hashem made for the existence of the world is not just merely that a physical world will exist, but rather that there will be a world that will remain in its existence and its purpose, which is that the mitzad the milas haneshama of Am Yisrael, that there will be a world that will conduct itself according to the principles of the essence of the soul, which is Torah and mitzvahs. And that's why he remembered the essence of the soul. He remembered that triggered. I'm sorry. When he remembered the essence of the soul, that triggered him and that brought about this covenant. And this gets expressed in the covenant itself. What was the covenant? That Hashem says there will never be destruction. And then he says, "Oid kol yemei haaretz," that all the days of the earth and the seasons and everything, lo yishposu, they will never cease. That means the world will conduct itself forever till the end of time, whenever that is, that the world will never cease, nature will never break down, no, there will be no collapse again as there was during the Mabul. This lack of shinui, this non-changeability, this idea that the norm of nature will never cease actually indicates the power of Ein Sof, of the infinite. Because really nature, mitzad atzmoi, nature in itself is something which is prone to changes and even to stoppages. But the koyach Ein Sof, the power of the infinite that Hashem invested and put deep down within the nature, especially through this covenant, this gives in nature that infinite power. And now we can also appreciate and understand what the Medrash tells us, that when Noach went out of the Teva, what did he do? He offered a korban, which was his prayer, his tefillah. And then what happened? It says, "Vayorach Hashem esreach hanechoyach." Hashem smelled the pleasing aroma of his korban, and this triggered Hashem to say, I will never ever bring a mabul again, and this brought about the covenant. What is it about this pleasing aroma? So the Medrash tells us this is not just any aroma. It's not because he had, grilled a nice piece of meat there, but rather this brought up the reach, number one, of Avrohom Avinu going out from the furnace of the fire. Remember when he was saved? Avrohom Avinu was ready to lay down his life, total and absolute Mesiras Nefesh, for the sake of Hashem. And then later the reach, the aroma of Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, also these three great prophets coming out from the Kivshon Ha'esh, from the furnace of fire, again where they were allowed themselves to be thrown in there just for the sake of Hashem, just for Mesiras Nefesh. And also the third thing, the reach of the Dur Hashmad, which was a time that there actually was the Nisayon, the challenge to one's faith was even more severe than it was for Avrohom Avinu and Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. And this triggered the loy oisif oilakala, that Hashem's decision never again to curse the earth, never again to punish the earth. The question is, why did Noach's korban in itself suffice? Why do you need to have these three acts of Mesiras Nefesh? The answer is because you needed Mesiras Nefesh. Mesiras Nefesh is synonymous with the power of the infinite. It is infinite. What do you think about it? Inherently, what is Mesiras Nefesh? That it indicates that somebody is serving Hashem without any limitations. Even when there is a situation that prevents him, or seems to be preventing him from serving Hashem, yet he overpowers it and he stands above it and he serves Hashem Mesiras Nefesh. In other words, he doesn't allow any challenge to get in the way. That is an act of infinity. That comes from the power of infinity. And therefore that triggered in Hashem to make the covenant and put into the world the power of infinity. The Rebbe adds that the union of Mesiras Nefesh, we say that it triggers Mesiras Nefesh when a person does not allow the challenges and the obstacles to stop them. That is the koyach of Mesiras Nefesh. The Rebbe says actually there's a deeper point. Moreover, that on a deeper level, the challenges themselves are what trigger the Mesiras Nefesh. And therefore this brought about this covenant that Hashem says, Lo yishboisu. And now we can appreciate why it was so absolutely necessary that when Hashem remembered Noach, it shouldn't be just Vayiskor Hashem, but Vayiskor Elikim. As we said, that the Elikim, the Midas Hadin, was Nishapech the Midas Harachamim. That it switched and became the attribute of mercy, of compassion. Why? Because what is the reason? What was the reason for this, as we said? What was the trigger? What was this memory? It was the etzem haneshama, the essence of the soul. The essence of the soul, as it says, lav mikol inun midas klal. The essence of the soul transcends all levels. It transcends all attributes. And therefore, there are no divisions of attributes. There are no varying classifications. This is this and that's that. The essence of the soul goes way beyond that. And therefore, midas hadin, it was converted into midas harachamim. And therefore, all the obstacles, all the challenges just fell away. And therefore, even in the future, when there will be an obstacle or challenge, we're already governed by the power of then, that power of Mesiras Nefesh, that power of infinity. And this comes down all the way that to us, in a practical manner, that even when we're in Golus, even when we face such darkness, and it seems like there are so many challenges around us, the Rebbe quotes the verse that the Torah tells us by Yetzias Mitzrayim, by the Makas Choshech, when there was the absolute and deliberate darkness all around, thick, heavy darkness, and yet, Olachol b'nei Yisrael, Haya'or b'nei Shvaisam, that all Jews had light wherever they are. That when we tap into this power, we have that light, that special koyach. And this, of course, will bring us to the time of the Geula, when also there will be a switch where strangers, amdu zarim v'ro tzayram. It's one of the prophecies is that the strangers typically steal from you. And here they will come, not only they won't hate us, and they won't want to hurt us, but the opposite, they will come and they will shepherd our sheep for us and take care of our property.